Oh, the first time I ever picked up a guitar was when I was about five and a half years old. My dad had one in the cellar, and I saw it leaning against the wall, and I asked, "What is that?" And he says, "It's a guitar." And he showed me 3 or 4 chords, and I was hooked. And I got a couple of years older, started going to Gene Autry movies, and fell in love with country and western music. Well, my parents bought me a keg at some time, and when I was about 8 or 9, I guess. And I started working when I was 15 in Coolidge, Arizona, out in the middle of the desert, in little clubs and places where, with a little country band. I needed an electric guitar, so I went to the hardware store in Coolidge and bought a Les Paul Gold Top for a 54 for about, I'm pretty sure I paid $75 or something. But that was a lot of money back then, you know. I was anxious to get rid of it. It was just hanging there next to a K on the rack in the hardware store. So about 3 years later, I was working in Phoenix by that time, working with bands on TV and dances and so forth. This group called the Sunset Riders. Decided I needed a new guitar. I wanted one with a vibrato. So I went into Ziggy's music store there one day, and Ziggy took me over and took out a case and opened it up and handed me this guitar. One but except it was a 1957 Chet Atkins Gretsch, which is morphed into a 2011 Duane Eddy Gretsch. But it's still a 6120, and I just got this. It's beautiful, I love it. Plays great and sounds good. I never took lessons on the guitar. I just taught myself and learned by watching people, and I only knew 3 or 4 chords, you know. C, F, G, and E. And I was about 9 or 10 before I realized you could play up the neck, you know. It would actually mean something. And I saw a guy going, you know, one of those jazz guys, and I thought, my goodness, he can make notes up here, you know. And I thought, that's amazing. So that opened a whole new world for me, and I actually learned by playing along with country records on the radio. Billy Bird was a huge influence, you know, because he kept it simple and everything. Of course, Chet Atkins and Les Paul were big influences, and Hank Williams Sr. was a huge influence on me. From him, I learned to get your own style, you know, do it with authority, and let it all hang out. And that's what I did when I started making records. My dad worked, he was the manager of Safeway, and a local disc jockey came in and he got talking to him and told him I played guitar, and he said, "Bring him out to the station, we'll make a tape." I went out and I played a Chet Atkins song, and he played it on his morning show. And went home in the afternoon, and this country singer, a local country singer, called me up and said, "We'd like you to work the VFW with us on Saturday night." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I'm ready for that yet or not." And he says, "Well, do you know Slipping Around? Do you know I Can't Help If I Still In Love With You, Hank Williams? Do you know Weary Blues?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I know all those." And he says, "It pays $15. I said, "Okay, I'll be there, I'll do it." So just no sooner hung up from him, and phone rang again. It was another guy who wanted me to work at the country club. And he says, "And we'll pay you $25. And I said, "Well, I've already got a job for Saturday night." He said, "Just call them, tell them you can't make it." So I said, "I can't do that." And he got really mad. And he says, "Well, I'll tell you something." He says, "You'll never work in this town again." I thought, wow, already I've been in the business 5 minutes. I've already heard that line. And this town is Coolidge, Arizona. I don't know if that counts. But the new DJ came to town, and his name was Lee Hazelwood. Then he started doing a Saturday afternoon show, and included us in that for 10 minutes of live music, and then playing records the afternoon. And was very successful. And one day he said to me, he says, "Duane, why don't you go home and write an instrumental?" And went home and wrote Moovin N Groovin. Anyway, that's what I wrote for the first song. And you get up to about number 70 was an anchor instead of a bullet. So they said, go back in and do something else. So Lee says, well, what do you want to do? And I says, well, I just had this idea kind of for a little melody that goes like, the studio we went into in Phoenix was very interesting. It was very primitive then. The engineer, Jack Miller, he was the engineer there. Floyd Ramsey owned it. Lee had been cutting there pretty much all the latter half of '57. So they decided they needed an echo chamber. So we just jumped in the car one day. Lee said, let's go check out some big tanks, big water tank, 1,500, 2,000 gallon, whatever. And so Jack and Floyd and Lee and I went down there one day, and they all took turns, we all did, yelling into these big 2,000 gallon tanks. And we finally found one that had pretty good echo in it, you know. We just yell, whoop, you know, and listen to it and see if it echo a little bit. Floyd had it trucked up to the studio, built a little rack for it, and put it outside in the parking lot, and they ran a speaker in one end and a mic in the other, and the stuff would come out of the speaker and swirl around this tank, and then the mic would pick it up, and we'd have echo. We had this great echo. So it was pretty primitive. But the first time I worked in a real studio was in Los Angeles, in Hollywood, on Sunset Boulevard at Studio B of United. And I did a record called Because They're Young in 1960. And we also had the LA Philharmonic, and they all came in with their suits and ties and little violin cases and cello cases and things. And Howard says, come here, I want you to meet a friend of mine. There's another guitar player sitting over there. And he said, Duane, he says, this is Barney Kessel. And I went, by the time the name hit me, I was starting to shake hands, and the name hit me, and I just went, what? I says, what are you doing here? He says, oh, I'm just trying to earn a living. And I said, my gosh, I can't believe this. But then I found out the drummer was Shelly Manne, and who was one of the greatest jazz drummers ever. And I thought, well, how's this going to be rock and roll? You know, I just shaking my head and went back, and we started doing Because They're Young. Ran through it once, and I thought, oh, let's see how it is. And because I learned that day that jazz drummers made the best rock and roll drummers, because they know how to get up on top of the beat and just drive the heck out of it, you know. And that's what Shelly did, and everybody followed along, and that record just rocks, you know. Anyway, that was my first session at a real professional studio with professional musicians.